LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the November 28th edition of LiberalViewer Monday Media Mixup. Thanks for joining me. Give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like what I'm doing. Today, that will be showing you the 13 best, most newsworthy clips I picked out from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, plus actually, I have a couple Fox News bias videos I picked up this morning, so that's Monday. You know, that's what I can do with the Monday Media Mix-Up, is I can throw in a couple Monday clips with the Sunday morning news analysis shows, which is what I'm doing. And when I put it all together, it should be a really informative, educational, fair use, media criticism, and political commentary show for you all today. You can see from the video title, I have like a double main topic, which is Biden wants to ban assault weapons while Trump dines with anti-Semites. And those were two of the big topics. I'll also be covering Ukraine. I'll also have a clip of Dr. Anthony Fauci's COVID pandemic update and what we might expect for this upcoming winter. And when is the pandemic going to end? Because it's still not really over, but so that's the final clip if you want to wait for that non-title topic. But before I get to any of those topics, I wanted to show you one of those Monday clips I was talking about. I often watch the Monday morning Fox News shows to see how they spin the clips on from the Sunday morning news analysis shows, and later I'm actually going to be showing you one of those. By the way, if you look down in the video description under Media Mentioned, you'll see brief summaries of all 13 of the clips I'm using, including clip 9, which is a Fox News bias clip misinterpreting clip 8 I'm going to show you, but that's coming up much later. But this clip I just happened to see because I was watching Fox News this morning looking for how they were going to misinterpret some of the things said on the Sunday shows. And this is like a self-refuting, this is just a teaser clip for a story they did multiple times, but they keep saying, you know, voter turnout is way up in Georgia. They said this during the November election, and now they're saying it for the Georgia runoff. You know, voter turnout is way up, so all those Democrats who claimed there was voter suppression going on were not being truthful. I hear this over and over again on Fox News, but the video they show in this clip actually refutes it, and Harris Faulkner, the host of Faulkner Focus, doesn't seem to realize it. I mean, she tries to kind of explain that basically the thing is people had to wait in line 2, 3, 4 hours to vote in the early voting in Georgia, and that's because part of the Georgia voter suppression laws is, especially in minority and Democratic areas, they cut by far the number of polling locations for early voting, for same-day voting. So that means in those communities, if you want to vote, you have to wait in line for 2, 3, 4 hours, and that is like a poll tax, really. You have to be someone who can afford to like give 4 hours or even 2 hours of your time to vote. That, I mean, that actually is a barrier to voting, but not if you watch Fox News in this like totally she seems Harris Faulkner seems totally oblivious to the way the video she's showing is undercutting her argument in the clip I will talk with you about a little more after we watch together here.
So Pete and I were just talking about this. The runoff race for Georgia Senate is on now. This is early voting over the weekend. Turnout is rocking. Looks like all those Democratic cries of Jim Crow 2.0 are once again dead wrong. Look at all the people in line. They go vote. Plus, actress Alyssa Milano yet again.
Oh, and then after that, they talk about how actress Alyssa Milano had this terrible faux pas because she's giving up her Tesla because Elon Musk is supporting letting these white supremacists back on Twitter. but she's going to an electric VW, and she didn't even know Volkswagen was founded by Nazis or in Nazi Germany. So that was what was coming next there. But anyway, later I'll show you another ridiculous clip. But do you see, like, they show all the people waiting in line for hours and don't even seem to understand that is voter suppression. That's like Fox News. I mean, Harris Faulkner is like the queen of low information voters, because that's what she gives her viewers, both in the Faulkner Focus, and you'll see later coming up on Outnumbered. She is the queen of low information voters because that's what she gives out, low information. And that was like bad information there. But anyway, I'm going to get to the news summaries from longest to shortest. The longest news summary, I actually even had to edit it down a little, was from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. Martha Raddatz came back from the Ukraine and at the beginning of this news summary, she does mention some of the other news stories, there's a travel surge, and she makes it sound almost like COVID is over, and then Biden wanting to ban assault weapons, and the Republicans planning to investigate Biden when they take the House. But then there's this long pre-recorded package from her recent trip to Ukraine, and I kept in the parts that's where it's more talking about U.S. foreign policy, and I cut out some parts about like the devastating effect on the people in Ukraine of this terrible war that was started by Russia and the Russian invasion. But so there's like an edit in the middle when she's talking to this British guy who's part of America, was like in the American military and is now helping the Ukrainians. He's like, I don't know, international man of mystery or whatever. But I'll talk about that news summary and what's going on in Ukraine a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. We begin this holiday season on a different note than 1 year ago when Omicron was sweeping across the nation. Officials still urging people to get vaccinated, but Americans are once again traveling in record numbers to spend time with friends and family, with few restrictions and cautious optimism that this winter will not be as dark as years past. President Joe Biden spent the Thanksgiving holiday with his family in Nantucket, vowing to push for an assault weapons ban in the final weeks of a lame duck Congress after a slew of tragic mass shootings in recent weeks. That plea is likely to fall on deaf ears on Capitol Hill. Republicans will take over the House in January and plan to investigate Biden's handling of the pandemic, immigration, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and his family's business dealings. The GOP also reviewing U.S. support for Ukraine as its war with Russia drags on. This morning, we take stock of these major issues at home and abroad, but we begin with Ukraine. I am just back from that war-torn country, my third visit since the conflict began. And while I have tracked what's happening over these many months, to once again see it up close is sobering. Russia using rockets to terrorize the population and target the country's power grid and infrastructure to undermine civilian support for the war, while leaving millions without heat and electricity as the winter sets in. Ukraine's defenders are pushing forward, trying to advance against Russian forces as they also work to rebuild and rehabilitate communities freed from Russian control.
It has been 9 months of fear, destruction, and unimaginable loss. Indiscriminate Russian strikes this week, pummeling residential areas, a maternity hospital, and power grids. Blackouts again paralyzing cities and towns across Ukraine as winter takes a brutal hold. And the fight is far from over. These Ukrainian forces are constantly training. Many of these soldiers have already been to the front lines, but many are going back. They are citizens transformed. Volunteers like Alexander, who runs a travel business, has seen relentless fighting in the east.
38-hour battle?
Yeah, and only 2 hours we have time for drink, for toilet, and for sleeping. Very hard.
Intense.
Yes.
And you would go back in a minute.
Yes, of course.
And Petro, who has a small business, unbowed even after estimates of as many as 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed on the battlefield. You will win?
We will win.
You will win no matter what.
No matter what. In Ukraine we say "воля або смерть." It's translated like freedom or death.
Freedom or death. And helping to train many of the Ukrainian soldiers, a team led by British-born retired U.S. Marine Andrew Milburn, who has seen the fighting perilously close. Colonel Milburn had multiple combat deployments and fought in the Battle of Fallujah in Iraq.
And Fallujah was my worst experience of multiple tours, Iraq and Afghanistan. Here, though, it's a different sort of fear. You're out in the open, but once artillery starts coming down on you, it's a sense of absolute helplessness, unless you are near some kind of cover.
And Milburn's team, the Mozart Group, does not carry weapons or join in the fighting. They train and they help evacuate citizens.
We were pulling kids out of Lysychansk, Novoheladsk as the Russians were closing in on the town. We don't have armored vehicles. The risk levels are off the charts for anyone who's served in the Western military. And yet we continue to do it because there's a need. And as winter approaches, that need is only going to get greater. You have to see these towns to believe them.
Right now, when you look at what the Ukrainian military strategy is, what is it?
It's a really good question. And I'm not sure that anyone can give a clear picture of that. In order to conduct a really game-changing, I keep using that term, offensive, you need sufficient resources as far as manpower and weapon systems.
When you look at where the Ukrainians are and the enormous amount of aid they've gotten, do you believe if they don't get more aid that it is conceivable they can win?
It is conceivable. Look, the West has been extraordinarily helpful in providing high-end platforms, but the Russians have adapted. This is not a criticism of U.S. foreign policy, maybe it is. It's just a sense that this is going to be a long, bloody war. Ukrainian victory is, in my mind, ultimately most likely. Unless the West really embraces the prospect of Ukrainian victory, and barring a black swan event, this is going to be a long, bloody slog.
A long, bloody conflict. Joining me now are two congressmen who will have a key role in providing aid to Ukraine in the future, likely leading the national security committees when Republicans take control of the House in January. Congressman Michael McCaul of the Foreign Affairs Committee and Congressman Mike Turner of the Intelligence Committee. Thank you both.
So, yeah, like I said, I edited out parts of that where Martha Raddatz had long interviews with people in the Ukraine, but that former U.S. Marine, British-born U.S. Marine, I think gave a really good analysis from, a U.S. military perspective because he has, U.S. military experience. And I've often talked about how Martha Raddatz, she's not she is a journalist, but she's also really close to the military-industrial complex. She has a lot of good sources, so she gets a lot of good stories, and she'll ask them tough questions sometimes, but she also can really carry their water and be like a spokesperson for the view of the U.S. military-industrial complex, which I guess is part of being the corporate media. And Martha Raddatz is kind of like the double-edged sword of corporate media on the Sunday morning news analysis shows. And actually, there is someone at Fox News who's very much like Martha Raddatz, who was the guest host of Fox News Sunday this week, Jennifer Griffin. And I'm about to show you that news summary, which she does the introduction and then passes it off to Lucas Tomlinson. And it's actually kind of biased, but I'm not going to show you a bunch of things that were on Fox News Sunday, some of which were almost like infomercials for the U.S. military-industrial complex. There was this long story about this football game that U.S. Marines engaged in December 1944, somewhere in the Pacific, I think, and the Mosquito, I can't even remember. But and then there was this long story about people who wore these bracelets to remember POWs in Vietnam, and how they, like, you know, some of the bracelet wearers met the POWs, and there was even like a third story, but there, like, almost half of Fox News Sunday was like devoted to give like really pro-U.S. military stories, and so it kind of reminded me how Jennifer Griffin is kind of the Fox News version of Martha Raddatz, but she's actually more journalistic than most of the Fox News hosts. Certainly more journalistic, more of a journalist than partisan hack Shannon Bream, who is now the new host of Fox News Sunday, but apparently was off this week. But there's still a lot of bias here. You'll see, like, the subtext to pretty much this entire news summary is Biden is screwing up the economy, and they, you know, there's the possible rail strike, and Amazon workers are striking, and China, there are people protesting in China, which you didn't really see. That wasn't talked about in this whole Ukraine war long slog thing. But one of the things that the protests and the COVID lockdowns in China have resulted in is lower oil prices. You know, when China shuts down, that means a drop in demand, and oil has like come down, and gas prices have come down a lot, and that actually might be something that really hurts Vladimir Putin, because that's where he makes all his money. That may make it harder for him to continue the long slogging war in Ukraine we just saw. Nobody really talked about that, about how the China lockdowns are causing a drop in oil prices, certainly not on Fox News. But the next news summary I'm going to show you is the Fox News Sunday one, and they talk about, like I said, the subtext is Democrats and Biden are screwing up the U.S. economy, which I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
And hello from Fox News in Washington. I'm Jennifer Griffin, in for Shannon Bream. Major economic concerns on a global scale, just as many Americans wrapped up Black Friday shopping and prepare for Cyber Monday. Protests at the world's largest iPhone factory in central China over COVID lockdowns. Amazon workers taking to the streets in dozens of countries as American railroad workers are poised to do the same here at home if a new labor deal is not quickly reached. In a moment, we'll be joined by Republican Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, a member of the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. But first, let's turn to Lucas Tomlinson, live in Nantucket, Massachusetts, where the president is spending the holiday weekend. Lucas?
Jen, President Biden has spent the last few days relaxing on this little island. But even while shopping yesterday here in town on Small Business Saturday, he could not escape questions about 2024.
Mr. President, how are your 2024 conversations going?
We're not having any. We're celebrating.
Nationwide, a massive railroad strike looms, with the potential to cripple the transportation of a third of all goods in the United States. After Biden took credit for averting a strike back in September, this time he says he's taking a more hands-off approach.
My team has been in touch with all the parties, in rooms with the parties, and I have not directly engaged yet because they're still talking.
Just days before, Biden's press secretary said the opposite.
The president is indeed involved directly, but I don't want to get into details at this time, but he has been involved. I just said the president has been directly involved. He's been in touch. This is the third time I'm saying he's been directly involved.
It's not just trains that could ground to a halt, but Amazon packages as well, after thousands of Amazon workers around the world walked out on the job on one of the busiest shopping days of the year, citing low pay and poor working conditions. Protesters also taking to the streets in China, rejecting what they call onerous lockdowns under China's oppressive COVID-0 policy. The violence extending to what is known as iPhone City, after 200,000 workers were forced into isolation in trash-filled dorms.
Yesterday, the U.S. Treasury Department announced it would allow Chevron to resume oil production in Venezuela. in an apparent bid to lower gas prices. Jen?
Lucas Tomlinson traveling with the president in Nantucket. Lucas, thank you. Joining us now is Republican Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, co-chief of...
So, yeah, that was the Fox News Sunday news summary. And you saw that one other similarity between ABC and Fox News, Martha Raddatz and Jennifer Griffin, I wanted to point out is that they both, Martha Raddatz and Jennifer Griffin, had Republicans on. You saw Martha Raddatz had 2 Republicans on to talk about Ukraine policy at the end of that last clip, and then you saw Jennifer Griffin had a Republican to talk a Republican on to talk about the possible rail strike, and they've really been pushing this possible rail strike, which isn't that much of a news story unless it happens, because it's very likely it's going to be resolved before it gets to a strike, just like it was before the midterms. But the Fox News has been playing that up. But anyway, you saw they both, Jennifer Griffin and Martha Raddatz, had Republicans on who they did not ask about the Donald Trump dinner with Nick Fuentes and Kanye West, the two, Kanye West, after making all these anti-Semitic remarks, and Nick Fuentes is like a well-known anti-Semite and white supremacist, going all the way back to Charlottesville, and I'll talk about that more when I get to the clip specifically about that. But both Martha Raddatz and Jennifer Griffin had on Republicans who they didn't ask about that. That did happen on a couple of the other shows, but I don't think on CBS News Face the Nation they ever even brought it up. But at least on ABC and Fox News they talked about it on their panel, and I'll have the panel discussion clips coming up. But let me finish the news summaries. Actually the middle news summary. Usually NBC News Meet the Press, Chuck Todd has the longest, best news summary, and Chuck Todd shows up with the longest package. Martha Raddatz had the biggest package this week by far. Martha Raddatz's package was so big I had to edit it down so it would fit in my show. But Chuck Todd spends his time talking about the recent mass shootings, both the one in Colorado at the LGBTQ plus club, and then there was the one in the last week, right before Thanksgiving, in Chesapeake, Virginia. That was, my daughter, who I use her voice from when she was much younger, saying LiberalViewer presents at the beginning of all my shows. She was actually in Chesapeake, Virginia last week for Thanksgiving, visiting friends there, and that was kind of scary when we found out there was a mass shooting in the town where our daughter was. But it was at Walmart, and she wasn't at the Walmart, and she's fine. But that happens to people. There's so many mass shootings. I think that's becoming like a common experience where you have like someone who, like a close friend or a relative who is like, at least in the city where there's a mass shooting, and you're like, are you okay? Are you okay? And anyway, that is the main topic on NBC News' Meet the Press this week. I don't know. It's a journalistic choice, kind of like ABC made the journalistic choice to focus on Ukraine at the beginning because Martha Raddatz had just come back from there. I'm not sure why Meet the Press decided to focus on the gun crimes and the latest responses. But anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that news summary together over here.
Good Sunday morning. Americans found themselves in a familiar place this Thanksgiving week, grieving for the lives lost in multiple mass shootings. In Colorado Springs, 5 people were killed at an LGBTQ nightclub. The alleged shooter is facing possible hate crime charges on top of the 5 counts of first-degree murder. 2 days later in Chesapeake, Virginia, 6 people were killed at a Walmart by a disgruntled employee who then turned the gun on himself. While the victims are new, the questions that these massacres spark are not new. And if there's a single issue that represents this stark red-blue divide in this country, it's evident in how each side responds to these massacres. Democrats stress the urgency for action, and called for stricter gun laws.
The idea we still allow semi-automatic weapons to be purchased is sick. It's just sick. It has no social redeeming value. Zero, none. Not a single solitary rationale for it except profit for the gun manufacturer.
Can you do anything about gun laws during the lame duck, sir?
I'm going to try.
What will you try and do?
I'm going to try to get rid of assault weapons.
Republicans condemn the violence, but blame the issue of mental health, not guns.
We see again in the Commonwealth and in Colorado and in Idaho these just stark reminders of senseless, violent crime, and so much of it is really a moment to reflect on the state of mind of America and Virginia, and this mental health crisis that we know we are in the middle of.
The fact is, we do have a mental health crisis in this country. Out of the over 40,000 deaths from gun violence this year, over half of them were due to suicide. But that doesn't mean that we don't also have a gun issue in this country as well. We are the only country in the world with significantly more guns than people, and a culture that fiercely resists any perceived restrictions on the right to bear arms, which is enshrined in our Constitution. And perhaps the main contributing factor to the now commonplace lack of response from Washington is the fact that voters are not demanding a response. Just 11% of voters picked gun policy as the issue that mattered most to them in casting their vote in this month's midterm elections. And in fact, in 7 of our 9 top Senate battleground states, that percentage was even smaller of voters who picked guns as their top issue. Whether they're numb, traumatized, cynical, or just have other issues affecting their daily life more, the reality is politicians respond to the public. And until voters make this issue a priority, it is unlikely Washington will. Joining me now is Jared Polis. He's the Democratic governor of Colorado. It is a state.
Hello? Oh, sorry. I don't know why. I had some problem with my microphone there. Sorry about that. But actually, Governor Jared Polis was on a couple different programs. I don't have clips of him. He's the governor of Colorado, and he talked about his ideas for gun control. But I do have a couple gun control clips coming up. But before both a Republican, James Comer on Meet the Press, and a Democrat, Chris Murphy, on CNN State of the Union. There are a couple things from that NBC News Meet the Press news summary. First, you're going to see this clip a few times in the news summaries. I think that was the first time where you saw Joe Biden say that there's no reason for us to have semi-automatic weapons. I think he meant semi-automatic machine guns or machine pistols like the AR-15. A lot of people think the AR and AR-15 stands for assault rifle, but it's actually Armalite rifle, which is like a brand name is like Kleenex or whatever. But the thing is, semi-automatic weapons, that's not just like the AR-15. A semi-automatic weapon is any weapon where you can squeeze the trigger more than once and get more than one bullet, like a revolver, like back in the Old West, like a six-gun shooter or whatever. If you can like pull the trigger 6 times and get 6 bullets, that's a semi-automatic. But of course, that's as opposed to an automatic weapon where all you have to do is hold down the trigger and it just keeps firing. And those are pretty much illegal machine guns, although there are all sorts of ways to like turn a semi-automatic weapon into an automatic weapon. But I don't want to go off into all that. I just want to point out that multiple outlets, I think NBC News Meet the Press, and then the CNN State of the Union news summary I'm about to show you also has the same clip where they show Biden saying we have to get rid of semi-automatic weapons. But I mean, semi-automatic, that just means like an Old West revolver is a semi-automatic weapon. That's like the wrong thing. Now, an assault weapon, that's something different, and there used to be an assault weapons ban. I actually saw early on in my live comments in the chat, somebody asking, how do you define an assault weapon? And there used to be a legal definition of an assault weapon, and I'll talk about that more when I get to the Chris Murphy clip. But I want to finish the news summaries. The next one is CNN State of the Union. Dana Bash, I believe, also shows that same clip talking about, this is mostly about all the things they want to do in the lame duck Congress, including the assault weapons ban and that clip of Joe Biden. But this is an important news summary to watch because it comes right before the Senator Chris Murphy clip I'm showing as clip number 8. This is clip number 5 if you're reading the clip summaries down in my video description. But you'll see Chris Murphy kind of responds to some of the things in this brief 1-minute, 20-second news summary that I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Hello, I'm Dana Bash in Washington, where the State of our Union is gearing up for the holiday season. President Biden returns from his Thanksgiving break in Nantucket today as he and his party look ahead to an ambitious end to the year. They still have unified control of the House, Senate, and White House for the next several weeks until a new class of Republicans takes control of the House on January 3rd. And Democrats have a long to-do list for December. A Senate runoff in Georgia that could give them a little breathing room over the next 2 years, as well as proposals to raise the debt ceiling, fund the government, pass election reforms, and codify marriage equality. It's not yet clear how much of that lawmakers will actually get done. And just this week, President Biden added another item to the Democratic wish list after deadly mass shootings in Colorado and Virginia.
The idea we still allow semi-automatic weapons to be purchased is sick. It's just sick. It has no social redeeming value. Zero, none. Not a single solitary rationale for it except profit for the gun manufacturer.
Can you do anything about gun laws during the lame duck, sir?
I'm going to try.
What will you try and do?
I'm going to try to get rid of assault weapons.
Here with me now is Senator Chris Murphy.
Okay, yeah, I don't know why I keep having problems with my microphone not working when I come back from the clip. Sorry about that. But yeah, you saw there the CNN State of the Union news summary that did also use that clip of Biden saying he wants to ban semi-automatic weapons, which I talked about maybe for too long before that clip. But I also want to finish up with the CBS News Face the Nation news summary, just a minute long. And it's been a while since I mentioned that CBS gave the earliest, best coverage of the COVID pandemic, like way back in January, February of 2020. They were the only one of the big 5 corporate outlets saying like that there was this virus in China and it might be something we had to worry about, and they were like covering it in their news summaries. And at the time I said, either they're overhyping the threat of this thing, or they're the only one of the big 5 corporate outlets who's covering the biggest story of the year in 2020. And I haven't said this in a while, but as we all know, it turned out to be number 2 biggest story of 2020, and maybe even 2021 and possibly 2022. And here's Face the Nation covering it. But remember the ABC News This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary I started with, where they kind of downplayed what's going on with COVID and made us feel like it's over? Well, CBS, in the shortest of the news summaries, gives us, I think, a better perspective on where we are with COVID that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that final news summary together over here.
For many Americans, Thanksgiving felt almost normal this year. But a year after the deadly surge of COVID's Omicron variant, we're not out from under the virus just yet. The CDC says a new COVID variant of concern, XBB, has surfaced in the U.S. And on the other side of the world, China is reporting a fourth daily record of new COVID infections as an unprecedented wave of protests ripples across the country. Demonstrators from Shanghai to Beijing are taking to the streets in anger over China's zero COVID policies that have kept much of the country under pandemic quarantine for years. Those restrictions are weighing on the global economy and threaten to snarl supply chains ahead of the holidays. But we begin this morning in the U.S. with the danger posed by 3 respiratory viruses. We spoke with President Biden's chief medical advisor earlier and asked him about the risks for people congregating this season.
And I will have a Dr. Anthony Fauci clip and what we might expect from COVID as my final clip. If you're reading the clip summaries down in the video description, that's clip number 13, but I just finished clip number 6, the final news summary, and I think you can see what I mean about how they were the only news program that started by focusing on COVID. That's why, based on their coverage back at the beginning of 2020, I said that maybe CBS should stand for the COVID broadcasting system because they had the best, earliest coverage of COVID, and I guess they're kind of sticking with ABC had some coverage of COVID this week as well, but CBS had the best, and like I said, I'm going to show you Dr. Anthony Fauci in clip number 13 at the end, but the next 2 clips here are on this assault weapons ban question. First, I wanted to show you a Republican talking about whether we need stricter gun laws. And this is kind of, there are so many Chuck Todd haters out there. And this is a clip of Chuck Todd doing a good cross-examination based on coming prepared, but a bad cross-examination based on listening to what the person you're cross-examining is saying and confronting them on what they're saying that's not true. If it, I know there are a lot of Chuck Todd haters out there, and he's not a great cross-examiner when it comes to the listening part. And as I've said many times, I think that I have some expertise in cross-examination, having previously been a criminal defense attorney, a public defender for about 5 years, and that was actually one of my strengths. Was I was much better at tearing things apart than building things up and creating things. And that's what I did. I would tear apart the testimony of witnesses, particularly police officers, but that's a whole other story. But here you'll see Chuck Todd is trying to cross-examine this Republican, and he has some good stats, some good statistics about where there are bad gun crimes, and it's not in Democratic areas, as you hear on Fox News and from Republicans all the time. But anyway, I will critique his cross-examination more thoroughly after we watch Chuck Todd try to cross-examine this Republican Congress member, James Comer, about whether there are any stricter gun laws he would support after we watch that clip together over here.
But I want to ask you on guns. I know what your personal position is here. Is there any gun law that you'd like to see stricter when it comes to the purchases of weapons?
I mean, we already have many gun laws on the books. If passing a bill would simply end gun violence, then I think you would have overwhelming support in Congress for that. That's like saying Congress could pass a bill to reduce inflation. That didn't reduce inflation. So, passing bills doesn't solve the problems. We have, as Governor Youngkin said, a mental health crisis in America, and I think there's overwhelming bipartisan support to fund better mental health programs and try to increase communication between law enforcement agencies and social services groups to try to better identify these troubled people before they commit crimes.
How would you suggest we go about preventing mentally unstable folks from purchasing guns if we don't have a waiting period or don't have certain classifications for certain weapons. Is there a way to do this?
Well, that's something that Congress is, I'm sure, going to discuss. It's been discussed the entire 6 years I've been in Congress. It's very difficult. You know, the number one priority with respect to crime in America for Republicans is going to be the fentanyl crisis. We talk about terrible gun crimes in America, but we've had over 100,000 deaths because of fentanyl pouring across our border, which is unsecured right now. That's going to be the top priority for Republicans come January.
I understand that, but these massacres, nobody wants to see them. I mean, it does feel as if we talk about the individual freedom of somebody to be able to have the right to bear arms. People want to have the individual freedom to shop at Walmart without fear of getting shot. So I guess, is there any place, any room, I know where your position is, any room to allow, if we had a waiting period with the Walmart shooter, it's possible 3 days he might have calmed down, or we might have found something troubling in his past and he doesn't get the weapon.
Well, Chuck, you talk about this a lot on Meet the Press, but when you look at cities that have the most strict gun laws, like Washington, D.C., Chicago, these are the cities with the highest rate of crimes committed with guns. So, you know, just simply passing more bills isn't going to solve the problem. I think we need to get serious about law enforcement. We need to invest in more law enforcement. And again, we need to invest in mental health and try to improve communication between our social agencies as well as our law enforcement.
I've heard this talking point about gun laws in cities, but I don't know if you realize this, the states that have the most gun laws have the least amount of per capita gun crime, and the states with the least amount of gun laws seem to have the most. I'm showing it here on screen. I don't know if you can see it here. So there is a correlation. If you have more gun laws on the books as a state, you have fewer gun-related crimes, gun-related deaths. That has been proven statistically.
Well, in places like rural America, where just about every other household exercises their Second Amendment rights, there aren't a lot of crimes in these areas, and I think one reason is because potential criminals know that these people are exercising their Second Amendment rights. So this is something that's indoctrinated in our Constitution. This is something that Republicans hold, close, and we're going to continue to protect our Second Amendment rights. But while at the same time we want to get serious about crime in America, the fentanyl crisis, as well as the looting that's taking place in cities, we believe that we need more law enforcement. We need to respect the law enforcement. We need to have prosecutors that are serious about prosecuting and not letting people off in the name of criminal justice. So these are issues that are going to be debated early on in a new Republican majority.
All right, speaking of the Republican majority, if Kevin McCarthy can't get 218 votes to be Speaker.
And of course, Chuck Todd then went on to talk about the Republican the fight for Kevin McCarthy to be Speaker of the House without any follow-up to the previous questions, and that's what I was talking about. You saw Chuck Todd did a great job of cross-examining this Republican talking point that, there are these cities that have the strictest gun laws, like Chicago, and yet they have the highest level of gun crimes. What's that about? But, of course, if you're a city, you may have strict gun laws, but in Chicago, if you want to get a gun, all you have to do is, go over to Indiana. Chuck Todd's cross-examination there was some statistics that went from the cities to the states that show that states with stricter gun laws have a lot lower per capita level of gun deaths. And by the way, I also wanted to give kudos to Chuck Todd in the news summary earlier, mentioning that more than half of the gun violence deaths are due to suicide. I mentioned that last week on my live stream, and that's something that doesn't come up a lot. But so Chuck Todd cross-examined James Comer there about how the states that have the strictest gun laws have the lowest per capita gun deaths, while the more permissive states, the more rural states actually have, where they let everybody have guns, actually have higher per capita gun deaths. And that was a good cross-examination, except then James Comer said, well, in those states we have less crime in the rural states where everybody's got a gun. But less crime isn't really the measure. It should be per capita deaths from guns, because you know why you have less crimes in the rural states? It's because there's a lot more land with a lot fewer people, but there's still a lot of guns there, and they, in terms of the amount of people they have, they still have more deaths. That's what per capita means. Means for the amount of people you have a lot more deaths. And Chuck Todd never really followed up on that stupid argument that James Comer made. And then he also, both the beginning and the end of his answer, talked about the fentanyl deaths. Like, oh, and that's something I see over and over again on Fox News, because I watch Fox News every day, way too much every day, and they keep talking about how Biden is killing Americans with their open border policy, letting all the, because all these illegal immigrant gotaways are bringing fentanyl into this country and killing Americans. But the thing is, fentanyl is actually coming in not through illegal immigrants, but through like the legal border crossings. Most of the fentanyl comes in hidden in vehicles through legal border crossings, which is something Fox News never mentions. And of course Chuck Todd never followed up on that. Like, well, that's actually from commerce between US and Mexico. If you wanted to like really tamp down on the fentanyl, you'd have to like search all the vehicles, and that would like cut down on our commerce and harm our, that would be bad for capitalism. But that's not something the corporate media brings up, and it's not something Republicans bring up, I guess. But anyway, the next newsmaker clip I want to show you is Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut talking to Dana Bash on CNN's State of the Union, both talking about how, well, first how we're not going to get an assault weapons ban, and also, what might happen in the lame duck session. But then at the end of this clip, you'll see Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut talk about maybe not sending federal funds to the 60% of counties that won't enforce federal and state gun laws. And then after that, I'm going to show you a Fox News clip that totally misinterprets what Senator Chris Murphy said. But even though I'm going to end this clip by showing you Fox News bias, I don't know, I think Dana Bash was a little too supportive of Democrat Chris Murphy in this clip, where she, I think at the beginning she calls him like a tireless advocate to end gun violence or something. That's not a very journalistic thing to say. But anyway, you can see Chris Murphy both talk about how he might want to defund, and that's the key word. Well, he doesn't say defund. Like, he says maybe we shouldn't fund the 60% of counties that won't enforce federal and state gun laws. And you'll see in the Fox News clip that follows this that they turn that into defund the police. But he starts off actually telling us how there was this assault weapons ban in the 90s where they had, it's kind of complicated to define what an assault weapon is, but there was a law in the 90s and Biden actually helped craft it, and it defined what an assault weapon was, and it banned it, and it actually cut down on mass shooting deaths there. And when it sunsetted and no longer was in effect, mass shooting deaths went up. And it was basically the AR-15 and a whole bunch of other semi-automatic weapons they're basically automatic weapons, like weapons of war that have been like sold to the general public without being automatic. Now they're semi-automatic, but they look a lot like the machine pistols and machine guns that are used by the military, like the AR-15 and various other ones. And there actually was a legal definition of what's an assault weapon back in the 90s, and that law saved lives, as Chris Murphy points out, among other things, in this clip I will talk about with you a little more after we watch together over here.
With me now is Senator Chris Murphy, a Connecticut Democrat and tireless in his efforts to reduce gun violence. Thank you so much for joining me. So you just heard the president. He wants to pass a so-called assault weapons ban in this lame duck next month. You know the math on how difficult that is, better than most people. You've been working on this for a long time. Is there any path to getting that done?
Well, first, let me say the president's been heroic in standing up for victims of gun violence. We passed the first gun safety measure in 30 years this summer. It's going to save thousands of lives, and that wouldn't have happened if Joe Biden hadn't led. He gave a primetime address. I'm sure some of his advisors told him that was not going to ultimately get the result he wanted, but he stood up and spoke his mind, as he did this weekend. Now, you listed the very long agenda we have from here to the end of the year. We've got to increase the debt ceiling. We've got to keep the government open and operating. But I'm glad that President Biden is going to be pushing us to take a vote on an assault weapons ban. The House has already passed it. It's sitting in front of the Senate. Does it have 60 votes in the Senate right now? Probably not. But let's see if we can try to get that number as close to 60 as possible. If we don't have the votes, then we'll talk to Senator Schumer and maybe come back next year with maybe an additional senator and see if we can do better.
Is there any action on guns that's possible, or do you think assault weapons, the so-called assault weapons ban, is the one piece of legislation you'll try for?
Well, that is the piece of legislation that has passed the House, that is sitting in front of the Senate. And President Biden is right. If we passed an assault weapons ban, we would see less mass shootings in this country. Yes, there are already tens of thousands of assault weapons on the street. Nobody's talking about taking those weapons away from individuals. We're just talking about stopping new sales. But if you look at some of the most high-profile mass shootings in the last couple of years, many of those mass shooters bought the weapon just days before carrying out the crime. And so if those weapons were no longer commercially available, only in possession of those who had bought them previously, I think a lot of mass shootings would have been prevented.
That is true when you look at most mass shootings. What we saw at the Virginia Walmart shooting, the suspect used a legally purchased handgun. Mm-hmm. A so-called assault weapons ban wouldn't have applied there.
If you pass an assault weapons ban, you are not going to magically eliminate mass shootings in this country. But it is true that AR-15 or an AR-15 style weapon is generally the choice of mass shooters. And what you saw in 1994 when we passed an assault weapons ban was a dramatic decline in mass shootings that remained in place for a decade until the expiration of the assault weapons ban, when mass shootings started to spiral.
I want to ask you about what you did pass. You mentioned it. 5 months. It's been that long since the president signed a bipartisan bill. You helped negotiate it. It expanded background checks, incentivized states to implement red flag laws. Virginia and Colorado, where these mass shootings took place over the last 10 days or so, they already have red flag laws in place, and they did not prevent those mass shootings.
I think it's important to know that the bill that we passed is being implemented as we speak, but it takes a little while for these big, complicated laws to be put into place.
But these two states already had. They didn't need the incentives.
Correct. Now, what we've, I think, learned in Colorado is that the county in which this shooting happened is a so-called Second Amendment sanctuary state. And I think the country's going to have to learn about what's going on in this country. The majority of counties in this country have declared that they are not going to enforce state and federal gun laws. They have decided that they are going to essentially refuse to implement laws that are on the books. That is a growing problem in this country. And I think we're going to have a conversation about that in the United States Senate. Do we want to continue to supply funding to law enforcement in counties that refuse to implement state and federal gun laws? Red flag laws are wildly popular, right? You're just temporarily taking guns away from people that...
So you want to withhold money for law enforcement?
I think we have to have a conversation about whether we can continue to fund law enforcement in states where they are refusing to implement these gun laws. I'll talk to my colleagues about what our approach should be to this problem, but 60% of counties in this country are refusing to implement the nation's gun laws. We've got to do something about that.
So, yeah, you saw there that Senator Chris Murphy explained both how the assault weapons ban in the 1990s that defined assault weapon, it's hard to define what's an assault weapon. It's certainly not a semi-automatic weapon, as I was mentioning earlier, but it's hard to define. But there was a law in the 90s that defined an assault weapon, and that's something that could be implemented again if there was the political will, and as Chris Murphy pointed out, like making it illegal to buy those types of weapons for a period of time did actually increase the number of deaths from mass shootings. I mean, most of our deaths from guns in the United States come from suicides, as I was talking about earlier in terms of the NBC News Meet the Press news summary. And also there, Chris Murphy talked about maybe cutting the funding to the 60% of counties that refuse to enforce the gun laws, that the federal and state gun laws that are passed to try to keep us safer. But I don't know, from that last clip I showed, would you come to the conclusion that Senator Chris Murphy was resurrecting or advocating for the second coming of defund the police? Is that what he was saying there? Defund the police? I mean, Dana Bash, to her credit as a journalist, actually asked a question near the end of that clip. Are you saying we should stop funding the police? Well, and he said, well, we have to have a conversation in the Senate about what we should do about the 60% of counties that won't enforce gun laws on the federal and state level. So he never really said defund the police, but over on Fox News, that was like all they heard. And I'm going to show you this outnumbered clip from Harris Faulkner totally misinterpreting the last clip you saw. And I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Begin with what appears to be a second coming of defund the police. Oh. A Democrat senator appears to be renewing the controversial movement. Maybe he'll try to redefine it. You know, they love that. Even after the president dismissed it heading into the midterm elections, and as a crime crisis continues to rage in major American cities.
When it comes to public safety in this nation, the answer is not defund the police, it's fund the police.
Fund with 3 Ds. But now Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut is questioning whether law enforcement should be funded with 5 Ds in states that refuse to enforce federal gun laws, the so-called Second Amendment sanctuary states.
The county in which the shooting happened is a so-called Second Amendment sanctuary state. They have decided that they are going to essentially refuse to implement laws that are on the books. I think we have to have a conversation about whether we can continue to fund law enforcement in states where they are refusing to implement these gun laws.
So, is this faux real or just faux?
I like that. Harris, I like it. I like it. I love it. Unfortunately, I don't love this, though, because it appears to be that second coming of defund the police. And, you know, as a fellow...
The second coming of defund the police? Did you notice in the clip of Senator Chris Murphy, they edited out the part where he said that 60% of counties in the United States refuse to enforce state and federal gun laws? And that's what he is worried about. And the thing that is like most disturbing about this is for years I watched Fox News talk about, Donald Trump, when he was president, he wanted to defund the police in counties that were sanctuary cities for immigration laws where they didn't want to cooperate with ICE. I've talked about the whole so many times. I made multiple videos about so-called sanctuary cities and states where they say local law enforcement should not cooperate with federal immigration authorities because that actually makes us all less safe. Because if local law enforcement is part of the federal immigration police and enforcement, then in communities where we have large immigrant populations and undocumented immigrant populations, those undocumented immigrants won't talk to local law enforcement when they're witnesses or victims of crimes. They'll be afraid to talk to the police, and so the people who perpetrate those crimes will not be caught because that's, because the undocumented immigrants in our community are afraid to talk to local law enforcement. That's why local law enforcement shouldn't be part of federal immigration authorities. And you saw there that on Fox News they have it all backwards, where now they're saying that was like a bad thing, and it's also a bad thing now for the federal government to punish local law enforcement when they won't enforce federal and state gun crimes. But they also really cut down what Chris Murphy was saying about how it's really about the 60% of counties that have made themselves sanctuary counties for people who want to have guns that violate federal gun laws or whatever. But anyway, that is the last of my clips on the Biden wants to ban assault weapons topic, and I think I talked about that in various different ways. And before I go on to my next topic, I also want to thank my super chat contributors. So far, I think I have to scroll back. It's not even showing in my Matthew, I saw at the beginning, gave a super chat contribution to my live stream, talking about how he's glad that I'm going to keep doing this live stream for another couple years, and that is my plan all the way to keep doing the Monday Media Mix-Up all the way through the 2024 election, because I was thinking I might be ending it at the end of 2022, but no longer. And then I also saw Tom Trask gave me a super chat contribution. So yeah, I really appreciate the live stream viewers who give me supportive comments while I'm doing the live stream, but also especially the super chat contributions, because I've already seen that this live stream has been demonetized. I appealed it, but I wasn't surprised because I have both the words assault weapons and the word anti-Semitism in my title, and those are just the kind of things that YouTube will immediately demonetize, and sometimes I win on appeal and sometimes I don't. I guess we'll see what happens this week. Last week I also got demonetized for most of my viewers who watched the show, and then I won on appeal when no one was watching anymore. But anyway, most of my revenue comes from not the advertising revenue I get from my live streams, but from the super chat contributions, from the people who click on the membership button, join button underneath the video. Super chat and YouTube memberships are good, but actually YouTube takes like a third of that revenue and keeps it for the big Google corporation. Down underneath the video description, you can see where you can become a monthly patron on Patreon. Patreon only takes like 10%, not like 30%. So that's why I like Patreon a little better. And then also there's a link down there to give a one-time contribution through PayPal. At the $5 and $10 level, I will send you. If you give either a $5 or $10 contribution through PayPal or through Patreon, I will give you both this hashtag LiberalViewer weatherproof vinyl sticker and this ACLU Constitution, so you can, check out what your civil liberties should be, whether there's a Democratic or Republican president. But anyway, that was the last of the clips on the assault weapons ban that Biden wants, that topic. And now I'm going to show you 3 clips on the Trump dines with anti-Semites topic, starting with CNN's State of the Union, where Dana Bash kind of introduces the topic and then asks a Republican who might run against Donald Trump what his reaction is. And I will talk about that clip a little more after we watch it together over here.
Welcome back to State of the Union. Former President Trump is attempting to defend a meal he shared this week with rapper Kanye West, who now goes by Ye, and white nationalist and Holocaust denier Nick Fuentes. Trump insisted Friday that he hadn't previously known Fuentes, but a source tells CNN he found the white supremacist, quote, very interesting, particularly Fuentes' ability to rattle off statistics and data and his familiarity with Trump world. Here with me now is Arkansas Republican Governor Asa Hutchinson, who is considering challenging Donald Trump for the 2024 GOP nomination. Governor, thank you so much for joining me. I know as U.S. Attorney in Arkansas, you personally prosecuted white supremacist groups. What's your reaction to seeing a former U.S. president associate with someone like that?
Well, I hope someday we won't have to be responding to what former President Trump has said or done. In this instance, it's important to respond. And as you mentioned, the last time I met with a white supremacist, it was in an armed standoff. I had a bulletproof vest on. We arrested them, prosecuted them, sent them to prison. And so, no, I don't think it's a good idea for a leader that's setting an example for the country or the party to meet with avowed racist or anti-Semite. And so it's very troubling, and it shouldn't happen. And we need to avoid those kinds of empowering the extremes. And when you meet with people, you empower. And that's what you have to avoid. You want to diminish their strength, not empower them. Stay away from it.
Trump has released multiple statements. What he's doing is he's denying knowing Nick Fuentes, but he's not condemning his views, let alone condemning Kanye West's history of anti-Semitic comments, recent history. So it's a pattern.
Well, I mean, you can have accidental meetings, things like that happen. This was not an accidental meeting. It was a set-up dinner with Kanye. And so this happened, but you certainly have every occasion that the question of white supremacy or neo-Nazism or denying the Holocaust comes up, you've got to be absolutely clear in your communication that this is not acceptable dogma, it's not acceptable conversation, it's not acceptable history, and you have to disavow it. It is as simple as that, and I'm very proud of the Republican Jewish Coalition. The former ambassador, U.S. ambassador in the Trump administration to Israel has condemned this. And so what Donald Trump did, and his failure to condemn it, is really the minority of the party. It's the extreme side of it, and that's what you've got to distance yourself from, and he failed to do that.
You told CNN you are very seriously looking at running for president in 2020.
And I don't know, I hope that Asa Hutchinson runs for president against Donald Trump, but I don't know how well that will work out. I mean, last week I was talking about how anyone who runs against Donald Trump in the Republican primary is actually like courting disaster. I was talking specifically about Ron DeSantis of Florida, but I mean, there are only two things that could happen. Either if Ron DeSantis wins, if Ron DeSantis loses, I mean, that's not really a good outcome from him because he ends up being a loser and Donald Trump is the nominee. But even if he wins, what do you think Donald Trump is going to do? Is he going to like gracefully concede? Have we ever seen Donald Trump do that? Gracefully concede? He's going to keep attacking whoever beats him and maybe even run as a third-party candidate. And actually, the next two clips I'm going to show you on this issue, I commend CNN's State of the Union, where they actually asked Asa Hutchinson, a Republican governor, to react to something Donald Trump said, to react to Donald Trump meeting with Kanye West and Nick Fuentes, these two anti-Semites. And of course, Nick Fuentes is also like a leading white supremacist who was even involved in like the whole Charlottesville Jews will not replace us rally at the, during, I don't even want to go into what the whole Charlottesville, Virginia thing that Heather Heinrich, whatever. And anyway, I don't want to go into that, but at least on CNN's State of the Union, Dana Bash questioned a Republican about Donald Trump meeting with these two anti-Semites. On ABC and, of course, Fox News, they had ABC's Martha Raddatz and Fox News' Jennifer Griffin, who I previously was talking about how they're both very close together. Martha Raddatz is more journalistic than Jennifer Griffin, but they're both very close to the military-industrial complex, which is kind of irrelevant for this panel discussion. But here you can see on ABC, they talked a little more about how Donald Trump was damaged goods. But you'll see it's very similar conversation on ABC and Fox News. They just talked about it on their discussion panel, didn't ask any Republicans to respond. But anyway, here's the ABC discussion panel. Martha Raddatz talking to panelists Donna Brazil, Sarah Isker, and Leanne Caldwell about Trump dining with anti-Semites Kanye West and Nick Fuentes, that I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch together over here.
Donna, I'm going to turn to you on this. The dinner with formerly known as Kanye West, now Ye, and Nicholas Fuentes, an extremist right-wing commentator that Donald Trump had dinner with.
When you go into a hotel, the first thing I look for is that privacy little door hanger. Where's his privacy door hanger? I mean, who vetted these two individuals? Open bigot, anti-Semite, a Holocaust denial dinner? Seriously? I mean, I would give him a gift card to McDonald's to avoid that type of commitment in dinner. I want to quote my colleague Chris Christie, and he said, "This is just awful, unacceptable conduct from anyone, but most from a former president and current candidate." That says it all.
And Trump's former ambassador to Israel. So how did this happen, and do you buy the excuse, hey, I didn't even know this Fuentes guy?
Oh, please.
No, we're sort of over those type of statements. I think that Donald Trump, it's interesting. He's showing himself as a more flawed candidate here in the run-up to 2024 than we saw, frankly, in 2016 or 2020. And you have a lot of Republican voters who like Donald Trump, who are realizing he cannot win in 2024. And I think there'll be a real shopping period in the Republican primary. What's interesting to me is, do we have this as sort of a 2016 cattle call where everyone's fighting with each other to get that one-on-one with Donald Trump? We know how that turned out. Or is this more like 2008, where the narrative is constantly around Trump versus DeSantis, and no one else can kind of get their balloon back up in the air?
I want to take that to you, Leanne.
Yeah, I think that, kind of echoing what Rick said, the investigations have shown that there is a weakness with Trump, even though his supporters might dismiss them as political witch hunts. But polls have shown that a majority of people, up to 58%, want the investigations to continue. Yes, most of those are Democrats, but what I know notice there's 20 to 22% of Republicans who also think the same. And so you're seeing a softening of support of Donald Trump, and that's why these Republican challengers are willing to perhaps challenge him in 2024. And Chris Christie, perhaps maybe he's going to be another one too.
The worst moment for Donald Trump this week was not at the Supreme Court where they told him to turn over his tax returns. It was not the DOJ special counsel. It was that 11th Circuit hearing over the Mar-a-Lago classified documents. Those were 3 Republican appointed judges, 2 Trump appointed judges, and it could not have gone worse for that Trump legal team. They were being asked nearly embarrassing level questions of how many different ways they're going to lose that.
And where do you see that going?
And where do I see that going? I think that there's a good chance that Donald Trump is going to be indicted on the Mar-a-Lago documents case in the next few months. I think I talked about that last week, especially after this whole 11th Circuit route of, I think the whole special master might be gone, but I don't want to go into all of that. But that was a fairly good discussion. ABC did not ask any of the Republicans they had on the show to respond to Donald Trump dining with these anti-Semites or Nick Fuentes, the white supremacist. But you saw there, Dana Bash did the best intro about it and asked Asa Hutchinson about it, the governor of Arkansas who used to prosecute white supremacists. And there you saw Martha Raddatz talking to their panelists. And there was it was kind of funny at the end. They talked about Chris Christie, who criticized Donald Trump by name for meeting with these white supremacists. And I don't know where Chris Christie was, but he's actually usually on that panel and is usually arguing with Donald Brazil. So that was kind of cute in a way that they mentioned Chris Christie at the end. But even that panel discussion that wasn't as good as asking any of the, Martha Raddatz had a couple of Republicans on, didn't ask either of them about Donald Trump meeting with these 2 anti-Semites in Mar-a-Lago. The Fox News Sunday panel discussion with Jennifer Griffin is even worse. The question she asked the panelists isn't even about, it's like, how are Trump advisors reacting to this dinner? It's not like how are Americans or even other Republicans like Asa Hutchinson and Chris Christie and Bill. Well, they mentioned Bill Barr briefly here, I think, but this is like the worst of the discussions of Trump having dinner with Kanye West and Nicholas Fuentes to up his cred with the white supremacist anti-Semites, I guess. But here's the Fox News Sunday discussion from yesterday that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch together over here.
Now to Donald Trump and his 3rd run for the White House. Are you surprised by the number of prominent Republicans who have come out against Trump? Even as Attorney General Bill Barr writes, Trump will burn down the GOP. Time for new leadership. What's the reaction from Trump advisors to his dining with white nationalist Nick Fuentes at Mar-a-Lago last week?
Well, there actually haven't been that many prominent Republicans who've come out against Trump. And you're even seeing, there's a few. Bill Barr has already condemned Trump before this. You see Chris Christie, he's pretty vocal. But even you look at people like Mike Pompeo, Trump's former Secretary of State, he's criticizing Trump without naming Trump, which tells me, and Pence sort of is being kind of gentle as well, which tells me that there is still a fear among Republicans, even ones who want to oppose him potentially in 2024, that Trump still commands a serious, meaningful proportion of the base, and they don't want to cross him yet. DeSantis, for example, has been completely silent. Nick Fuentes, to your question, one of the most virulent anti-Semites and just open racists, Holocaust denier. You just go through his clips. It's kind of staggering to listen to. Trump's advisors, most of his core team right now have been through, Charlottesville, Access Hollywood, go through the list. this is sort of another day in the life of. They don't run around lighting their hair on fire. I sort of see some people say, oh, they're all freaking out. That wasn't been my experience the last few days of talking to them. These are people who've, it's sort of just another day at the office, actually. And one person said to me, and I saw someone else sort of tweeted this, but basically their take was, and this is a Republican official, was he invites one notorious anti-Semite to dinner, Kanye West, and he shows up with another notorious anti-Semite. So, the surprise was that there was two rather than one.
But it's doubling. That should be cause for concern for people.
Two is worse than one, yeah.
All right, Olivia, early voting is now underway in parts of Georgia. Obviously, there's a...
And you see that after Jennifer Griffin talked to Jonathan Swan from Axios, they immediately changed the subject. Didn't even talk about it as long as they did in the previous clip on ABC. That was like the total coverage on Fox News Sunday of the titular head of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, meeting in his Mar-a-Lago resort with anti-Semite Kanye West and anti-Semite and white supremacist Nicholas Fuentes. That was kind of the worst coverage, but at least Fox News Sunday spent a little time of their panel talking about it, but I think they kind of underplayed it. Before I get to the final Newsmaker clip, I did want to thank, I got one more Super Chat contribution from, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this screen name, but it's Iskovimi Garga gave a $10 Super Chat contribution saying I was a great American. So I hope I can live up to that praise from Iskovimi Garga, if I am saying that name correctly, which I think I probably am not. But I think that when I was growing up, when I was learning civics and government in high school, the head of the political party, if after a president was voted out of office, that president remains the head of the political party until some other person is nominated to be. So unless someone else is nominated to be the Republican nominee for president in 2024, or until then, Donald Trump is actually the titular head of the Republican Party. And the titular head of the Republican Party met with known anti-Semite Kanye West, and apparently got the surprise benefit of meeting with known anti-Semite. And you just saw, I guess the one thing I should give Fox News credit for is they had Jonathan Swan on to talk about what a virulent anti-Semite Nicholas Fuentes is, and some of the really gross things he said about Jews in the past. He kind of referenced that, but I mean, that is where we are, and I think it should actually get more play that the head of the Republican Party is meeting with white supremacists and anti-Semites, and as he has already declared his run and as the front runner to be the nominee for president of the Republican Party in 2024, or I don't know whether that's going to happen. You saw in the last couple clips they were talking about how Trump might not be as strong a candidate in 2024 as he has been in the past. But anyway, you can let me know what you think in the comment section. And before I finish, I want to also show you this clip I promised you, where Dr. Anthony Fauci gives his prediction of how the COVID pandemic might proceed. And I mean, are we going to have a yearly booster or a more frequent booster to stop this COVID pandemic, which actually I think might get worse in the next several months? I've talked about that before. I mean, I've done everything I can do. I wear a mask when I'm in public. I have gotten like all the shots. I think I got the shot. I got like my original 2 Pfizer shots, and then I got the Pfizer booster, and then I got like a Moderna booster after that for people who are over 50 years old. And then just like a month or so ago, I got the bivalent booster. So I've had like all the possible shots, and only like 15 or 20% of Americans have gotten that bivalent booster. And if you haven't gotten that bivalent booster, you're crazy. Why not? I mean, that is the most important thing that anyone can do to try to save the U.S. from another wave of the COVID pandemic. And that's kind of what Anthony Fauci is saying in this final newsmaker clip from CBS News's Face the Nation, that I've multiply explained why CBS might be termed the COVID broadcasting system, and they kind of made up or showed why that is true this week. And here's Anthony Fauci talking about what might happen with the COVID pandemic, what variant we're going to get, and how many boosters we have to take over in this clip.
So what is the prevalent strain that you think we are going to be facing this winter, and does the recent booster shot, the bivalent, protect against it?
Okay. The ones that are on our minds right now that you do remember is the BQ1 and the BQ1.1. The reason you keep an eye on those is that they have what's called a transmission advantage, in that they are evasive of the protection that you have. Those viruses evade the protection of the monoclonal antibodies, Evusheld, and some of the other monoclonal antibodies that are used for treatment as well as prevention. It also diminishes the protection that is induced by vaccination and by prior infection. It doesn't disappear, but it brings it down a few fold.
So are you envisioning that in the spring we're going to have to get a new sort of cocktail of booster shots to match this new threat?
I don't know, because it really depends on what is going to happen in the spring. If we get, and this is what I'm hoping for, I'm a cautious optimist, is by the time we get to the spring, the level of immunity that's induced by infection, with or without vaccination, with or without boosters, among the entire population is such that the level of severe disease and infection is going to go way, way down. And you won't require having every 4 months or so giving somebody a boost. You heard us, we in the public health arena, talk about the likelihood of getting a cadence of maybe once a year that you get it with the flu shot. Just like the flu shot. But it's a little bit iffy about that. That's good because there's a neatness to that. You know, once a year you get it in the fall. But that doesn't take into account that you have to keep up the possibility that we will get a variant that's very different than the variants we have right now, that might require a springtime or some summertime boost. If it stays the way it is now, I hope it just gets down to that very low level.
Yeah, that was not very, that made me kind of worried, especially if you know that like 15 to 20% of Americans have gotten the bivalent booster, and you heard Anthony Fauci talk about how he's cautiously optimistic that the COVID pandemic will drop to a very low level, but based on the amount of Americans who are, you know, getting the latest vaccinations and wearing masks and taking precautions, I am not at all optimistic, but I guess we'll find out in the next few months. Maybe that's going to be the big story again, or maybe not. I guess we'll find out, but I will keep covering that story and all the biggest stories from the big 5 corporate outlets on the Sunday morning news analysis shows through the end of this year, and it looks like through the end of 2024, as I'll talk about a little more as we get through the end of this year. But anyway, those are the clips that I picked out for you this week, and I will continue picking those clips out every week. I appreciate my live viewers for supporting my live stream, and especially those super chat contributors who I already thanked. And if you're a recorded show viewer, there are links down underneath the video and the video description as to how you can support my live stream on a one-time basis through PayPal or on a weekly basis through Patreon. And I will keep doing this live stream as long as it seems like a reasonable thing to do, probably through this year and 2024. But anyway, until next week, or until I have some other reason to upload a video, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.